Hello, and welcome to another Language of Creation book club. I hope we all had a nice Sabbath where we participated in controlled floods, because one person here at least had his floodgates opened. I am assuming that there's multiple people here that stood in front of the floodgates and took the full front to the face. But yeah, I'll out myself as that person. So yeah, I'm facing a lot of things. Just I realized a bunch of things. One of one of them is that I kind of started seeing the purpose of the writing of Genesis, and like that allowed me to connect to the text in a whole new way. And then today I was reading this book and I saw also, oh, he's trying to do this. Okay, now it makes sense. Although I still don't agree, I think it makes sense. So that relieves a bunch of frustration in relating to it. It's like, okay, like I guess this is going on, and within that framing, he is correct, right? So this is where you get into problems, right? It's like, okay, like it's true but still wrong because you're in the wrong frame, right? Or like maybe I'm still not seeing something, right? Like you have to kind of toe that line because you can't discount everything just because you think you have a better frame, right? Because you might miss something, which is the other thing that I came into uh, this this idea of that if you're reading a text, you don't remember things. And I was like, wow, okay, like I never thought about that. And that in there's a reason why you don't remember because you don't have a way to store it in your mind. You don't have the connections that make it relevant to you. So that means that you're missing something, right? Like you're not connecting to the purpose of the writer uh, in certain means, and therefore, like hopefully, the writer was connecting to a deeper reality as well, right? So then you're also missing on that aspect, and yeah, so I'm like, oh, okay, like that changes a lot. So that's also some insight I wanted to present everybody with. It's like that's the way that you can attend to the way that you're reading, or that things come up in the book club, and it's like, oh, I did not catch that. Like, how did that happen? Like, well, what is it? What is there in me that does not allow me to see what's there? So, yeah, so I'm gonna try today in the book club to attend to the purpose of the writing and align in the purpose. And I think if we're discussing anything, we should at least honor the purpose, even if we disagree with it. Because if we don't, then we're probably missing something. So that's the position I'm going to take. Castle, you can take it away.
Sure. So this week has been a weird week, but not in the ways that the previous weeks have been. And it's been actually interesting because I didn't, even though I had read this book a long time ago, I hadn't actually read ahead. I've been kind of doing these week to week, and didn't really know which chapters were coming up because I had been waiting like 6 weeks for us to get through chapter 49. And but realizing that we are hopefully, if we get past one chapter today, going to talk about ornamentation and seals and that sort of thing. And I realized that a whole bunch of things this week were kind of falling within that category. In fact, I had like recently made certain purchases that were like all related to ornamentation and literally like supplies for making wax seals and stuff like that. And so it's just like something that I hadn't done in like 7 or 8 years. And that it's just like, oh, there's a lot of these things that are kind of coming up, or this aspect of the the thing that is not just the stumbling stone that becomes the cornerstone, but the thing that's completely left over that winds up being put at the top. Like, we had the old diagram of the bell, and I made the analogy, a couple months ago probably, of like the bell tower. That the entire purpose of building the bell tower is to put the bell up there, but you can't actually put it anywhere until the entire thing's completed. And I've kind of noticed some of the projects that I've been working on, honestly, for maybe about now 10 months or something like that, that just weren't able to take root, suddenly are able to just kind of like show up more or less effortlessly in like a new space that has just opened up within like the last week. So that's been a very interesting sort of thing. I mean, there's still lots of work to do, but it's been very interesting how ornamentation and seals, like this aspect of the last little touch of vanity actually being the thing that holds off the floodwaters, in a sense, or kind of like puts it's kind of like the cherry on top that completes the the presentation. So no doubt, these cycles kind of happen over and over again and everything, but it's interesting to see that like the last 6 weeks or so have kind of come up to about this. And so I think we're going to see a lot of interesting stuff this week. Danny, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. So I'm very glad to hear, Castle, that you've been waiting 6 weeks to get past chapter 49, because I struggled with this section quite significantly. I made my tagline "Mr. Young Grasshopper" because it feels like it felt like a Mr. Miyagi moment was going on in the book, except the wisdom or mystery hasn't been revealed yet. People talk about don't give up on this book until you hit some point of inflection, and for most people, it sounds like it's after Matt gets through establishing the pieces for making all the transformations that he does. But reading this section, it really felt like we're seeing the scope of the transformation to expand in new ways with these kind of meta moves and the crowning of time and space. And as we start to introduce like a lot of these concepts, like the ornamentation and everything, it seemed as though these concepts and ways of thinking are beginning to really interleave, where he's painting these pictures with tension in it, like how completeness is in tension with whatever the other one he mentioned, for example. And so as the ideas are getting more lofty, it's just been difficult for me to relate to. But I sense that there's, I don't know, a lot of poetic. I don't know. I sense that this is very dense, and I'm missing a lot of it. So I suppose that was a long-winded way to say that I feel as though we're approaching a crescendo in the book, and I'm struggling with it. So I'm here to gain an understanding of it with the group. Who wants to go next? Chris?
Yeah, I put for my headline here, navigating change. Yeah, it's been a thing this past week that in various places, people who were like maintaining order in certain spaces are no longer going to be doing that for various reasons, and so gonna have to navigate that across several different layers. That's kind of how I'm thinking about things. Alina?
Mine is the same as last week, trying to figure out the balance between the land and the sea and overflooding. I think I've been able to get some clarity on that this week, but that required embodiment and participation. So, yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I mean it's been a tough week for me, so I really don't have much. Uh, book is still as natural as ever for me, so look forward to see where people are struggling, particularly in 49. I don't know if it's just the layer of abstraction people are struggling with, because it is higher, for sure. It's one step higher, or if it's just the fact that it's being added in the middle of we'll say the top layer, and people don't, it's harder for people to see. So I'm looking forward to engaging with that and seeing where it goes.
No, I'm confused. I think we did 49, right?
we finished last week with 49,
Yeah.
but I think 50 is kind of a continuation.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, I mean this finishes up the whole thing, right? 49 and 50 and what is it? 51 and 52 are just the wrap up of this whole chapter. So it, but it is
it's
all a
also the
continuation of this
crowning on the
expansion.
chapter.
Well, right, but I mean that's what I was talking about, right? Like it's not the highest frame in the book, but it's also not the frame
Yeah.
that you live in per se. It's in the middle of those two frames. That I think is what people are struggling with. So the integration of 49 is what's important, right? Because that's the inflection point, I think, is that particular chapter.
Well, yeah, I do think he was bouncing in between the big frames and the smaller frames without being really clear about it. But yeah. So the thing I saw in chapter 50 is now there's a relation to the outside, like Mark already pointed at it. So I actually was having a lot of trouble with recognizing the idea of the crown until I saw that it was disconnected. And then I was, oh yes, it's disconnected. Okay, great. Now I accept it. But yeah, like at some level there was an issue there, and so like yeah, like I see it as an orientation to the outside, right? And so when we start with the stone rejected by the builders, has become the pinnacle stone, that's a specific relationship to the outside, because that's saying that the outside is becoming the highest. It's not only the outside gets integrated, like no, the inside needs to attend to the outside. So that's a specific relationship, and the pinnacle zone in some sense sustains, right? Like it prevents from collapsing. It holds the space in which you live. Yeah, and so the first thing that I think I want to do is invite us into like somewhat of an experiment, because the analogy that I saw with moving under a pinnacle stone is you have to adopt the stone as your top, because it's not there initially, right? Because that's what the stone rejected by the builders means. Like it wasn't accounted for, it wasn't integrated, and then you adopt it. And so the analogy that I found is a woman marrying into a family, right? So she's moving from one head to a new head, into new habits, a new house, right? New space, new relations, all of that, and in there has to reinvent herself to integrate, to become part of the space. So I guess I want to put that to everybody before we go into the chapter. Like do we see something in that analogy?
I mean, I can definitely see that as a, if you have kind of the straightness and then like sort of the cyclical, that if you're kind of, you're receiving a crown in a sense to your family, or in many ways, like with the wedding, like you're receiving a ring, into the family. So those things are very similar. And I was just thinking of the sort of thing of the pinnacle stone or the crown, as that when you put in the pinnacle stone into like an arch that has that, like you actually, it has to come from above as well. Like you can't raise it up and then slot it in. There's kind of like all the rocks or the stones that are there kind of come to almost like a V, and then you have to put the thing on top, and then there's capstones as well that kind of hold everything together. But it's that one little like critical point, like literally pinnacle or like peak or point or pin or what have you, that is the thing that's holding together that, like, all of the kind of geometry that would otherwise kind of fall inwards, if not for that. And I think we see that with sort of, if you think of like a really good like matriarchal exemplar, that like you might consider them like the glue that holds the family together, or something like that. Like they're kind of the ones around which everyone kind of revolves, and I think Marcus kind of mentioned this scenario that sometimes he mentioned some sort of scenario where there was a lady that just kind of showed up and no one knew what her name was, but she was just solving every problem, even though no one realized that they were problems until she solved them. And it's like, oh, wait a second, things can get better, and it's just like, oh, there's an example of just like, who is this crown that just showed up and just glued everything together.
Yeah, so another way to frame this, I think, in the Bible is grafting onto the tree. So, like they presume pre-existing structures in some sense, or like something higher that you put yourself under or into or part of. So building the meta space, I see it also. A different word for that would be a container. You come into a container as an entity, so you're partaking in something that houses you, or a body would also be a word there. So you enter a body.
I like the container thing because I was just looking at the etymology of the word contain, and it kind of evokes the imagery of the pinnacle stone. So it's to hold together or to restrain together, something like that. So there is kind of like, even though the things are kind of there together and this thing is coming from above, or is placed from above, that everything is actually also being put under a certain constraint. Because otherwise, if you don't have that constraint, then everything kind of falls apart as well.
Yeah, and I think fractal pattern is the right thing to think here. I mean, he's saying metaspace as mentioned in the previous chapter, right? In other words, he's saying the patterns from the previous chapter are here in a smaller scale, right? And that's really like, you have to understand 49 to understand 50, right? He references it directly. And then understand that this is inside of 49. 50 is inside of 49 in a way, right? But he's also above some of the lower floodwaters and stuff like that, right? So he's building this sort of at some point top and bottom at the same time, and now filling in the middle, with the fractality, the self-similar fractality, and that I think is, that's why you don't know how well you understood 49 until you start hitting 50, because it's a direct reference to those concepts.
I'm also thinking of the sort of when a while back we had the whole like two wrongs or two rings make a right, or two turns make an upright or straight, and thinking of also the sort of architecture of the arch as well, that it wouldn't make sense to just have half an arch. So if you're going to actually have something stable, you actually need the two halves of the arch, but also in order to even have the two halves, there also needs to be a third thing that holds them together. So it's like that if your intention is to make the arch, then out of the intention of erecting these two sides of the arch, it actually, the third thing has to proceed from that intention to actually complete it.
Yeah, well, I would look at the different angle. It's fulfill the intention, right? But yeah. So, me see. Another thing is we all reject stones, right? So that means that we can become part of things, but for whatever reason we cast out that stone. And in some sense, in the realm of ideas, that would be like a dragon, right? It would be something that's really intimidating. And beyond there's the treasure, right? Like the pinnacle stone is in some sense the treasure because it allows for a new relationship, a new way of being, right? Like it allows you to be placed under something. So that's an interesting reflection to have. And what do you do about that, right? Because like in some sense that stone is calling to you, right? Just like the treasure behind the dragon is calling to you.
I'm thinking an image that kind of comes up is a silly image, but I think it's apt. Is like a jigsaw puzzle with a lot of pieces that you're going to wind up coming across some pieces that say, I have no idea what this thing is actually supposed to be. That you look, if you have like a picture for reference, it's like, what even is this? Like, no, I'm throwing that back in the box and I'll come back to it later. And then you know, if it's like a 5,000 piece puzzle, that it's just like, yeah, you might have like 5 things in the back. And then finally it's like, oh, that's what it was, you know, and then you can actually complete the thing, but you still have to go. And sometimes those puzzles take people like months to complete. So there's an element of like having to wait and then remain like faithful to the purpose, you know, and then everything kind of gets resolved as you do that.
Why do you think people start building the puzzle? That's a good reason to build the puzzle.
Puzzles are related to exploration, right? And puzzles are related to completion. So in order to have discernment, you should do a puzzle, because that'll teach you good discernment. And it'll teach you methods of discernment. Like probably everybody knows this, but I mean, there was a time when you didn't. You start with the corners, then you go for the edges, and then you can start to fill in the middle. I know people who don't use that strategy. They actually fill in the middle first. There's different ways to do it, and figuring out what way works best for you is part of why you would have a puzzle. Another reason to have a puzzle is that you already have certainty that this can be done, and you know what the outcome's going to be. So it's really just practice working, and it's practice doing rote work, which is super important. We don't practice that anymore. Everyone's bored all the time and wants a new freaking notification from their phone. And puzzles teach you to get away from all that, among other things. But there's lots of good reasons to do. I mean, there's always the Mount Everest reason, right? Because it's there.
I'm thinking of there's a line that's hopefully going to come up during this session that is about like adding a final touch of vanity to seal off something and kind of bring it to completion. And that is one of like a jigsaw puzzle is kind of it's a vain thing in many senses, because a lot of people, they just wind up, once they finish the picture, maybe they take a photo of it or they show it to somebody and then they just crumple it all up and they put it back in the box or something. Some people will actually go and glue it to like a board or something like that. But even still, like a painting on the wall or like a picture or something like that on a wall is more or less like it's an ornamentation. Like it's a bit of vanity that, you know, or even, you know, like a rug or something like that ties the room together. You know, you have all these types of things that you might have. So it's a little bit of this like participation in vanity for the purpose of like rest, but also it's not something that's necessary. It shouldn't be something stressful either. I mean, maybe some people get stressed out doing jigsaw puzzles, but it should be something that is done over a long period of time, you know, not on like a timer or something like that, you know, unless you're like competing for whatever reason.
And my nephew, he does puzzles and he just has to put a shape into a hole, right? And it's like, then he can't make it happen, right? And then you do it, and then he's like, wait, what's this magic? Like, like it doesn't work for me, but it works for you, right? And then you slowly see him conquering this well, stumbling stone, effectively, right? And now his participation changes, right? And then it's like oh, now I can put things away in the place that they belong or something, right? And like it's a sort of victory, right? But like the amount of repetitions he goes through just doing this one movement, and then he re-engages with a different purpose on the same constraint of like literally the puzzle piece and the hole that it fits in, right? It's yeah, it's in some sense it's conquering reality, just being master of reality. Um,
There's an example that I'm going to hold off on until the next chapter because it's more appropriate for me. But there's a nice everyday example I think will be useful.
Yeah, I mean, why do the Tibetan monks do sand mandalas? Right, same reason you do puzzles, right? To get that cyclicality, that returning sense, that engagement in work that ultimately appears to be fruitless, but in the moment that it is completed and is still valid, that's where you find the most beauty, the most interest.
and we have a tradition in Carnival with parades, and they make these huge carts with moving papier-mâché stuff on there. And it's like they work on that all year, and then they bring it out for 1 day or 2 days, and then it's back in the shed.
Or like
So
fireworks. They just
yeah,
send it up in the sky to explode. It's great.
What I thought about, in terms of the adding a touch of vanity to bring the thing to completion was when I was young, I would watch all these engineering TV shows where like Scrapyard Wars or Battle Robots and stuff, where people have like engineers have like 6 hours to do something, and they always prioritize getting swag done on time, because adding glory to the robot or whatever the thing is that they're building is actually a very important part of what's motivating the spirit of everybody participating in the thing itself. So like when I read this verse, the stone rejected by the builders becomes the pinnacle stone. If I think of the pinnacle stone of being just a foundational thing, it's kind of boring, if just in terms of logical consistency. But when I conceptualize it as the most beautiful or the most precious or the most glorious, that motivates me to worship it. The beauty makes me want to go do like something in response to it or something like that. So anyway, those are just some observations I had relating to these ideas.
okay.
I like
Does
this bit.
anybody?
Just
Okay.
one thing in the at the bottom paragraph is this thing of whenever a space reaches the limits of reasonable integration, there's an inevitable encounter with the stone rejected by the builders. So I was thinking, now, if we can get to the last chapter in this section, that is gone over in detail, but it reminds me of, there's actually something that Mark mentioned in a recent commentary video of his, which I still is going to take me like a week to comment to because I got some contrast to create, and he's made more work for me. But there's a part where he talks about you look into the darkness and it eventually stares back, or you look into the abyss and it stares back, and that it's necessarily like you reach the end of something, and like there is a limit there, so you are going to wind up encountering something. Like you can't just go in one direction forever and actually not run into something. And so a lot of times, and there is that sort of aspect of kind of like if you kind of keep staring, like there might actually be something there, assuming you actually are meant to be staring. Like you didn't go there out of curiosity, but you had to do this. There is kind of a necessity there, and maybe something you can bring back.
Yeah. So I had this note. You need to focus on the problem, right? You can't you can't see it. You can't find it out without fully attending to it. Um, to fully attending on that dragon, right? That's just like plaguing you, and inviting you to conquer for the treasure. And yeah, like you shouldn't fight the dragon if you don't have to, right? Like if it's not in your land, then like please leave it, right? And I think that's also like what is the relationship that we we have with these things, right? Like how much are we called to resolve these things right now? And are you the person that's supposed to do that, or like is there someone else that should resolve that for you? Um, so yeah. So here we have the graph that we kept having, and now that's inserted in between two things, and the tail is pointing to the crown in some sense, uh, at, like it's saying that there's more, which means that there's a bigger hole that can contain the the more, um, and I think that's the means by which it's pointing to the crown, and also gets lifted up, right? Because in some sense the tail is the thing that is leading in the crown. It's inviting towards the crown. It's showing the existence of the crown. And we had I watched Pageau talk about the morning star, right? So the morning star becomes before sunrise, right? So it's announcing what comes next. And I think that's the way to look at the tail, right? It's the announcement of more, of higher.
I really like the announcement thing because I was thinking of this. I was like, I had been associating the bell as like a type of crown, and I still kind of maintain that in a sense. But the idea of it being a tail for the larger animal, so to speak, I was thinking like if you think of a bell tower, there's like a rope hanging down from that. You actually have to like grab the tail of this bell to invite people to attend to the tower or to start, what the tower is attached to. You're actually pulling on the tail and doing the invitation. You're calling people out to then attend to. Oh, where is that coming from? And then that's where people kind of like turn and go there if they have their obligations.
Yeah, I like that, right? Because the bell is in the bell tower, right? So it's up in heaven, and there's a reason, right? So maybe there's something wrong, right? Which would literally be the tail, right? The thing that's wrong is the thing that doesn't fit into the order. And so you announce it with the bell, and then you call everybody to attention, right? And now you have to commune to resolve the issue, to integrate it, right? And yeah, that's how you have to get bigger.
And to that point, that if there's the bell tower, if it's an alert for like an incoming threat, but also for the sort of necessity of integration, if it's, hey, come to church, it's also exactly the same thing happening.
Right. So there's two reasons, I guess, right? Yeah. One is Sabbath, and the other one is, yeah, something big that needs attention, like a dragon or an invading army or a fire, or like. Then the next bit, like under in this graph, that was yes, because like now we're talking about tension arising between space and time, and like I think that's a better frame than opposition, right? Like they are in tension, right? So they have they have a unity, and that unity sometimes gets strained, and in that strain, right? Like that's the call, right? That's the strain is ringing the bell, and it's asking for integration. So yeah, I don't like the second part where he's going back to the battle thing. It's like why are we doing it in that manner? Um, but well, I have to say, so I wrote this week about Scandal, and a scandal is also, well, that's what a tale is in some sense, right? It's that which can't be integrated, that which doesn't fit in. And so it's interesting that it comes here. And I wrote at the bottom that I had a hard time writing, right? Because there's different relationships that you can take towards the scandal, right? You can outright deny it, right? You can fight it. You can try and integrate it, and we'll actually see that in the coming chapters. These relationships to like, but this adversarial nature, yeah, is only if you're threatened, right? Like, and if you take the stance of being threatened, right? Because you can imagine a hostile animal coming at you, right? And it's like, well, are you treating that as a threat or are you treating that as a potential pet? All right? Or so like what's the way that you're affected?
Yeah, or you can treat things like an animal that's trying to kill you when they're not. Right? Like you can always fantasize the whole thing, which is, and it's interesting, right? Because he says space is flooded by foreign elements that dissolve the bonds holding everything together. You can just look around. Like, I don't think that, like just like peek out the window. You'll see that, right? But it doesn't have to be the integration or encounter with something hostile. You can make up something hostile in your head that's not hostile, and we do that all the time, right? That's the rebellion. Just sitting there like, no, this thing does not agree with me, and therefore it's my enemy. And it's like, wow, that's quite a leap. So everything is not a binary. In fact, probably nothing is. And so life gets much easier when you realize there are higher and lower possibilities, because it takes you out of that adversarial ideal.
Right, and we see that in the first footnote, right? Like they can become the horns of the devil. Also reminding that horns are pointy. Also crowns are pointy, right? So that's interesting. And then Jesus had a crown of thorns. You have the thorn bush. Well, anyway.
It's coming up on the next page.
Just quickly, how do you properly die when the threat that you perceive isn't? Actually, I don't know how to formulate my question well yet. Maybe I'll come back to it.
Well, the problem is,
it.
right? Like you don't know if the threat is going to kill you, right? Even if it's imaginary, right? Because like you don't know. So there's two options, right? Like one you go in with faith, or the other one is you don't and you reject it, right? But I think it's important to not be lukewarm, right? So you can't stay in the middle, right? You can say just like for example, like there's an alley and you don't trust the alley, right? It's like, well, either you take the risk or you don't, right? But you're not going to stand there deliberate whether you should take the risk. Like that's not an option. So you have to make that determination first, right? And then secondly, you make a commitment, right? Like you bind yourself to God and you're like, okay, like I'm going to be this person, right? And like if you decide to be this person, a person of faith, right? Like you just committed yourself to dying. So it's not how do you die properly? You're just gonna die. Like that's what you do.
So I'm thinking there's sort of a scenario that's popped up, and I think this is something that that Jordan Peterson had kind of mentioned something like this like years ago. But I like the sort of third perspective as well. So I'm thinking of a scenario of like a field mouse comes into a house and there's a mom and a baby, and the baby's like 1 year old or something like that. And Jordan Peterson has kind of made this assertion that if the baby sees the mouse, that it's not going to freak out, but will look to the parent and see, okay, what is the reaction, because I have no frame of reference for this. And so if the mom goes and it's just like, oh, it's a field mouse, and just takes a broom and just kind of brushes it out of the house, then no big deal. The kid doesn't panic or anything, sees that it's fine. If the mom picks up the child and then runs screaming into a room and locks the door behind, then that rat is clearly like a destroyer of worlds that just invaded our house and there's nothing we can do about it. Or if the mom is just like, whatever, there's a rat in the house, and just lets it run around, like that's actually maybe the worst option. It's just, yeah, we're just going to let vermin, just get into the house and we're going to do nothing about it.
Yeah, so the second part, the second footnote, crown is remain or surround, right? So it's in some sense, the surround is that which is bigger than you, right? Like that's which is outside of you. So the crown, basically, if you look at it in terms of container, right? Like it designates a space that is larger around you that you are part of, right? But you don't have the perspective of the crown, right? So it's also like it's not in your layer, right? Like you're not participating on the level of the crown. Um, and I think that's also how it's somehow alien, and also it has an eternal form of mystery associated to it. Like you don't own the crown. Um,
That is, I really like the sort of the cutting off and also the foreign. So I like the definition of foreign as kind of just like just outside the door, like actually just not inside your door. It's literally where foreign comes from. And this thing of, when we were talking about like the a woman marrying into a family, that Matthieu said this in like an old interview from like 3 or 4 years ago, that this thing of the dowry, and that giving a dowry at a wedding is not like an insult or anything. It's that in the time when people were like living out in the middle of nowhere and they were living super far away from each other, if someone's daughter got married, like you didn't see her again, or you saw her once a year or something like that. Like now it's not really an issue, but there was a time when it's like if you got buried out in the desert or something like that, and like your daughter goes to another family, and it's like, yeah, you maybe see her like a few more times in your lifetime, maybe. And so it's like the dowry money or treasure or whatever you give is not like a purchasing or ownership, like you said. It's the sort of like you've just taken a hit as a result of this sort of grafting onto the tree. And so for this reason, like, let me kind of try to compensate you for the branch you lost, and it's like there is that kind of opportunity at, say, like Christmas or some other holiday or something like that, of this kind of reunification or Sabbath or Jubilee or something like that, that can happen. But even still, like, you're going to wind up having that separation. I mean, now, like I said, it's for better and worse. There's a lot more convenience and interconnectivity, but that was more pronounced way back.
yeah. So getting the favorite word meta again. Um, I've been talking a lot about source. I think change and source are related, right? Because the source is always feeding. Um,
So this metaspace image, as it's called here, I remember seeing this like 3 years ago when I read this book the first time, and even though I actually didn't have nearly the same number of insights that I've had recently, instantly I saw Crown of Thorns and Transfiguration in that, like in this diagram, just like actually instantly I was like, oh, that's interesting that both of those actually map pretty well onto this. So with you have the crowning of thorns, as you mentioned on the previous page when we were talking, but looking at this, you also think of in that story, you have the different tiers of disciples that were left at different stages going up the mountain. And then you have this sort of crowning of time that the sort of you have people that appear out of different eras, and you also have this aspect of the elevation of even the clothes that are being worn. So it's like these are kind of maybe not completely common robes, but still the type of thing that someone could reasonably buy in that time that are turned into something higher. So there is this kind of, super elevation that's taking place there. So it's almost kind of like a not just a crowning, but it's like every single aspect is crowned in some way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or maybe
I like
encompassed,
this.
right? Encompassed within, subsumed by, right? And the fact of the matter is, you're a lot of people use meta this way, right? They use meta to mean extra dimension, effectively, right? Which is an extra dimension. If you have 4 dimensions, that's outside of 3 dimensions, technically. And that's more what this is pointing to, right? Like if you crown space by time, you've multiplied space by time. Like that happened. Like, and so that's that's the way you're able in cyclicality, that's the way you're able to resolve completeness and consistency. So that's how it makes sense as a quote meta space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked this one, the image, because you have the it's a nice picture of the self-similar fractality stuff where you have the floodwaters below, but you also have the time up above as a sort of microcosm of that. You have, you've got the unknown things below the floodwaters, but there's also the mystery up top that you can wonder about.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's yet another microcosm of kind of like the firmament in a sense that you have the separation of the waters, yes. And then yeah, I like
that. And the high contrast, the mystery below, and the mystery in front, right, which is the future, right? So the past is murky to you, the future is murky to you, and the rest of it is in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And not forgetting the asymmetry there as well. No contention? No. Are we actually fast at this point? Like, what's going on?
We'll find out.
We'll find out. Oh, okay. Well, you wanna start this one off, Castle? Was this the one, or did you want to have a?
Well, I mean, I'm just excited about the rest of this book, honestly. Like we've finally gotten to the meat and potatoes, so that's good. But I really like this aspect of resting and then doing the rest is honestly just so clever and accurate. So this sort of thing of that it's not just the time of rest and renewal, but the time in which God completed his work, right? The human scale, this is sort of like the final touch. And I made a reference to this like a while ago about like a Christmas tree that you could have, say if it's, especially in, like a suburban area, you don't have like an actual, organic tree, but you have one of those constructed ones or something like that. So you have, if you have a big family, there's the parents go and they make the structure of the tree and they build it and everything like that. And then they rest and then they call the kids to do the rest and put on the ornaments. And so that's something that I referenced without knowing the chapter number a while ago, and I'm glad that we finally got there.
Yeah. So the way that I framed it is the ornamentation is that which goes beyond function and enables life, right? Else we'd be robots. So there's something that needs to go beyond, and it houses and it relates to the outside of the order, right? So and thereby it also is inviting in from the outside, right? It's there's a relationship of well, remembrance to not the inside, to not the function.
And all of that also plays out in the Christmas tree. So you have that whole aspect of once the entire thing is ornamented, and then you put whatever your regional equivalent of a crown is on the top of the thing, then it's ready to start integrating the presents at the bottom. Which, as Matthieu mentioned in one of the footnotes in the previous chapter, that the word crown can also have a connotation of mystery or secret. So you have all these kind of integrated secrets and mysteries from the outside that are supposed to kind of manifest later on. And it's also like there's a potentially penalties or infractions that can be made if you try to integrate those things too soon before the appointed date.
Yeah, the word that I've been playing with a lot is promise, right? So like a calling is also a promise, right? Like, oh, there's something there, and like the something holds something for you. And then some promises are made by God, right? So there's like an implication of goodness there as well. The establishment of new ground, right? Like the reaching of the promised land.
Do you think there's necessarily like some kind of veil involved in the promise? Because I'm thinking of like wrapping paper now. If you just put the actual item unwrapped, it's not really like it's just kind of out of reach at this point, and it's just like, well, okay, here it is. Here's the thing you want, but also it's just going to be there. But like it seems inappropriate to have it unwrapped or not secret at that point, because then it's just kind of like that thing where, oh, here's the thing you want that you didn't even know was a thing, maybe, and then now you're just going to be like in anguish for 25 days or something like that as you see it just sitting there.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that has to do with the idea that it has to be attained, right? This is the other thing I've been thinking about is gratitude, right? So if you didn't work for it, if you didn't yearn for it, like if you didn't build your relationship to the mystery and you just get it shoved in your lap, like how are you going to be grateful? So like yeah, like that failing. Another word that I've been thinking about is membrane, right? It's like a veil is somewhat of a membrane because it like lets in and out that which is appropriate. And yeah, so like a packing of a gift is like, okay, there's a promise that you're gonna get this, but also you gotta wait till you get to unpack the present. Like that's always a big deal with the kids, right? Like they have to wait and they want to rip that stuff off. So there's also the aspect of reward, right? And then and the ritual, the glorification, right? All of these things come in.
I like the membrane thing too, kind of giving away just a little bit of something. Because when you look at it, like especially if if it's something that the kid has clearly wanted for a long time and the parents acquiesce at Christmas or something like that. Like if it's not in necessarily like just a kind of a rectangular box, they might have some inkling of what it is. Like there's a little bit of information that you can still kind of get, like not something so overdone as like a bicycle, but if it's like, you know, a ukulele or something like that, like they're gonna have a rough idea of, oh, maybe this is that the thing that I wanted, you know.
Well, and that's the veil and a membrane too. That's a type of filter, right? And as an ornament, it prevents reason from forcefully integrating all that is pointless, fluid, or strange, right? And so one way to look at that is to say, if someone's wearing a veil, right, that is a way of disrupting reason, right, and keeping force away. It's a filter for those things. And doesn't mean it's, you know, universally reliable and consistent, but that is what it's doing. It's acting as a filter. It's providing that mystery, and mystery is attraction to some extent, right? And it's also allowing all things at the right time, right? Back to the presence. Like, you're going to get the gift. The gift has to be on premises before the time you get the gift, right? Just practical sort of distribution of goods matter at some level, right? And so that veil, that wrapping of the gift, is something that shouldn't be torn away too early, we'll say, and that ornamentation allows for that to happen, right? Because there's a beauty on the exterior and a mystery that is also beautiful on the interior, and they're different types of beauty. And so that filter, that veil, helps to make that work.
So in the Netherlands, we have a transition in Saint Nicholas, and like in some sense, that's over Christmas, like as more important. And in the party of Saint Nicholas, well, like it's also in Christmas, you have all the things around it, right? It's not only the night, but like the whole society is living towards it, right? So in the Netherlands, you have the presents that come via the boat from Spain, right? In a steam engine, and like you can get put in a bag and get taken to Spain if you're not nice, right? And like the old part is like you'd be able to get spanked as well, like all of the things was in there. But we ended up with the tradition, and this is generally when people get older, is we make a surprise, which means surprise in French, I think. And the surprise is basically you put the present in something artsy, right? So either it's beautiful, it's hard to attain, it invites ridicule as well. It's accompanied with a poem that is often read up front, and the reading of the poem often is associated with the person or with the present and the attainment of the present, or both, right? And so the present is not only a present, but it's also now it's like a rite of passage, right? Like you have to go through this in order to attain or to become worthy of your present. And depending on who's drawn your lot, which is literally the way that we do it, we divide by putting them all in a hat, right? To who's going to draw whom, and it's going to be responsible for making the thing for them and buying the present. So there's also this chance thing, and yeah, like sometimes someone roasts you real bad, right? So yeah, this it's interesting to look at it in this frame.
I like the idea of having to earn it, because it reminds me of, so we had this thing back when I was in middle school that and I think a lot of people do this, called like Secret Santa, where they do the thing where you draw a random name out of the pool of people, and then you're the one that gives them a gift. And it was my old buddy Richard. I think we were in like 7th grade or something like that. And I got him, it was just like a $20 gift card or something like that. But I did the thing where I had an enormous box, and then inside it was a series of packing peanuts and other boxes and everything. And he had to dig through all of this trash in the middle of the classroom in order to actually get to just a tiny little gift card. And there is that aspect of like extreme vanity that is actually to the point of like major hindrance, just completely packed up just to kind of, earn or become worthy of like taking the sword out of the stone,
Yeah. So we also have things like my parents hid things in the house, so there was like this quest of discovery as well. But like often, like people have this big surprise, and you have to go through all of these things, and then you get a piece of paper, and then it was in the hall all along, right?
Hmm.
So you went through this thing, and the present wasn't even at the end, right? It was just the hint to where the present really was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to point out too. You know, as described in the verse above, the Sabbath is not just a period of rest and renewal, but the time in which God quote completed His work, and so you can look at the Sunday liturgy as the celebration of that, and also the encounter with the ornamentation, right? Because churches are supposed to have ornamentation. If you have a good church, it'll have ornamentation, and that's why, right? That's why that's happening, quote, on the rest day, right? Even though there's a celebration, maybe a solemn one or something, but there's a celebration on that day, which is the completion of the work. And so, in some ways, that means our our celebration of creation is the completion of creation, right? And that's why God's resting.
Yeah, I think the idea that the Sabbath requires first fruits is important, because if you, in order to have the Sabbath, you must give it your first fruits. So when you attend to it, it requires your best attendance, whatever that, it could be best concentration in order for it to be done practically. I think a lot of us, we work with our minds. And so if you're burnt out and you're using the Sabbath as your quote unquote rest day, maybe you're not, going to, maybe the Sabbath won't happen. Maybe you're not actually having the Sabbath. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I like that idea. Like I also think like if you're doing work, you don't want ornamentation. Like because then it's going to be in the way, and it's actually going to be dangerous, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is, uh, I was thinking about weapons, like ritual daggers or ceremonial halberds or whatever, and they became ridiculous at a certain point, right? Like they became so extreme that they couldn't perform the function of the weapon anymore. Um, and you have the Sikh who have these amazing daggers that they weld shut because they basically renounced the use of force with uh, with the purpose of commitment to God, right? So there's something there also with like the reminder and having the ritual or the ornamentation over the function, right? So like as a remembrance of conquering or something, right? Like it's not even necessary. Like I'm protecting the king, and I don't have to protect him because like his authority just permeates and people don't attack him. Like that idea.
so the thing that I notice about this is that, like, the Sabbath and the covenant are these things that, they keep the tension between these forces that are in tension. And to me, it seems as though that's a devotional thing. Like, the covenant is the thing that keeps the floodwaters back. Some people could allow the floodwaters to come forward, like, I mean, mentally, you could say, by betraying the covenant with yourself. You could just start, who am I? You can just start tearing yourself to shreds, for example, and then the
Mm.
floodwaters can come forward. And that to me seems to be a violation, like, or it's a devotional thing. Like in this case, maybe a covenant with yourself, let's say, but with larger bodies, these forces are always going to be in tension, and we can lean more towards these various time or space. But what's I think I like this model because, to me, what it seems as though what's important is knowing who's paying attention to see who's establishing the covenant, and then I can exercise my discernment and either agree to submit or rebel, or perhaps take some other stance to it. But seeing the covenant and the Sabbath as the thing that brings forward your best, that to me, it strikes me as being very, very devotional.
Well, I would argue there's a promise. There's a promise extended, not a covenant. The covenant is the manifestation of the promise. So I think this keeping the flood waters from leaking back into space, that sounds to me like entropy resistance, um, like a state of renewal, a reaffirmation, right? Devotion. Well, it's the it's the remembrance of the devotion, right? And thereby devoting. So the other insight I had is like, okay, you need to treat everything as a verb, at least in the Bible. It's like, okay, it's not devotion, it's devoting. like it's the doing or the partaking in the being devoted or something, right? Um,
Yeah, I like the way that that kind of ties together with the kind of doing the rest on the Sabbath or Lord's Day or what have you. That this aspect of, you know, and as I kind of mentioned with the Christmas thing, where it's like, okay, the kids do the rest, you know, but also there's this aspect of keeping the covenant, or keeping could also be seen as like to set eye on, like to keep an eye on, or maybe even to observe. And so there is kind of like a preservation aspect to that, or to carry on. I think I'm looking at some of the etymology stuff. There's this sort of thing of like keeping the course, and so there's a time element to courses, and so, and also remembrance. I mean, a lot of these things are kind of falling within like a lot of larger categories that are sort of swirling around, but um,
you have setting and keeping, right? You,
Hmm.
you first set something and then you keep it there.
Yeah.
Well, there's also what I'm seeing is the sentence about how the covenant or the seal guards against the powers of time, against absurdity and all these things, which is a little bit ironic because the seal itself is absurd and pointless and all of these things. You know, like the ceremonial daggers you mentioned, Manuel. It's like you have this weapon that is actually like its function is no longer being served. Like its function is something different than it than the weapon was made for, right? So in that sense, the seal is also like the idea of having a little bit of the poison to protect yourself from the bigger poison, because you're sort of indulging in this slight amount of absurdity at the edge of things in order that the large amount doesn't overwhelm you. And for me, this links for me to, for example, gardening. I do a bit of gardening. It's decorative. It's, you know, it's not functional. Like I don't put my bread on the table with the gardening that I do. And it's a seal because like it's kind of absurd, but it's kind of enjoyable. And also it's a seal because if things in my life start to go bad, I'm not going to do the gardening anymore, and that'll free up space for me to do important things to keep to keep my life running. And so it's kind of discardable, but it's important that I have it there because if I don't do the gardening, then I will fill that time and space with things that I do need to do. And then if things start going bad, I don't have the flexibility to recuperate from the catastrophe that may happen.
Yeah.
I really like
So
the seal thing, like sealing with vanity. So just a few examples that kind of came to mind. I was thinking of screen doors. So it's like that's not going to actually stop anybody from getting into your house, but it will stop flies. It'll stop the little things that will kind of disrupt the space and everything. But it is kind of, it's a vanity that seals off the edge of the space. And then I was thinking of, you know, at like grocery stores on the way in, they have those fans that keep the flies out hypothetically, and also they ruin your vanity if you have hair long enough to be ruined. Those sorts of things. That I was also thinking of, like trick or treating as we're coming up to Halloween. So you have this aspect of, okay, we're going to do this once a year. We're going to placate demons the one time that knock at our door and they show up looking monstrous and everything. But when you do it, you're giving away your vanity. So you have candy in your house, and you always hear those things where people are like, well, if the kids don't come, I'm going to eat it all. And it's just like the more you kind of get it out of your system or out of your space on that day, the less you actually wind up retaining after that period.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about all these Asian shows that I watch, and they have all these paper walls, right, and paper doors, and like they actually they want to open the door, right, when there's a catastrophe going on, right? Like they actually still respect the door for being a door, right? They don't break through the paper, which is like,
Yeah.
and so you can see the spiritual binding that happens, right? Like people respect the order in such a manner that the physicality is not even relevant. And so you also have this idea of the elephant that's bound by a stick in the ground and a rope around it, right? And like it won't extend beyond the space of the rope because it learned that that's the boundary, and and that these things become more real than the real boundary because like at some level there's no real boundary, right? Like there's just you teaching yourself here's the end, and you're not allowed to go beyond that, and so to go back, Elena, to the dying, right? Like that's what's going beyond the boundary is, right? Like that's dying.
A Bible story that this chapter reminded me of is when King Solomon builds the temple in Kings, and he builds the temple, which would be the space, and then inside there are engravings of open flowers and gourds, which is kind of like the seal or the vanity upon a space that has been established.
We also have to remember, right? Like God created the Garden of Eden for man, right? So that's also that space. I don't know. Is it, I think no, I think it's in the next part of the book where they start talking about the garden as the space that is basically where God can find man can find the intention of God, right? Like and so it's the space set apart, but also like it's cultivated. It has bountifulness in trees, right? So you don't have to partake in all of them. Like there's
I'm looking forward to us getting to those. I was just thinking of just kind of the absurdity and necessity of making your bed. So there's this aspect of sealing off the sleep, or this kind of lack of control. You're also kind of sealing off, like if sleep is sort of a microcosm of death, you're also kind of sealing that off for the day. And there is this aspect of if you don't make your bed, like all I have is just a comforter, so I have less of an excuse as someone who has like a whole bunch of different types of sheets. And if I just leave that not properly put over, like the amount of judgment that I feel just without not even like anyone else saying it, it is enough of a negative signal for me to have to actually go and do that, because I feel like something is actually kind of encroaching on me if I don't seal that off a little bit. Like I need to shut that box. And I remember hearing, there's these police officers I used to work with, and they used to say, like no matter what, just make sure that you're always making your bed, because if everything else goes wrong, at least you had one win. And there is that kind of aspect of like, if you have just like a grain of sand to stand on, at least there's a little bit of stability. Like you did something.
Yeah, that's the participation in the signals around you, right? And also the stability. The only stability you can give yourself is in your actions that you do every day, right? Nothing else gives you stability. That's the grounding that you can use to relate to the rest of the world, right? And of course, there's a deeper grounding, right? Because stuff was here before you, but you can't relate to it unless you have that signal that you're generating yourself in things like making the bed or opening the door and let the screen door allow the wind in without allowing the bugs and the leaves and all the other stuff that might blow in, right? There's all these ways in which we have these signals, and they allow us to respect boundaries even though we don't have to, right? That's what a rice paper door is, right? That's what you do when you train your puppy and you put him on a 50-foot rope in the park, and he learns to never be more than 50 feet away from you, even though dog can run. And and again, it's not perfect, right? Because you don't live in a perfect world, but it works, and it works pretty damn well.
Right, it shouldn't be perfect, right? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but they keep the collar on, right, without the rope, which is also like an ornamentation at some level. It's a reminder of the existence of the rope.
There's also identification, and like a lot of times it has a name on it or something. It's kind of like the office of dog is indicated by that crown.
No, that's good. I mean, one of the problems we have in materialism is this linear discrete relationship where we go, what is a color for? And we answer with exactly one function. And nothing has one function. Nothing. Anywhere. Nothing you've ever interacted with only had one function, because it's not possible to serve a single function. It's not the world we're in.
So, yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I'll repeat it. It's it's an extension beyond the single functionality, right? That's what ornamentation does in some sense. So that's also the recognition that things don't serve one function. I think that's the same thing from a different angle. Then at the bottom of the page we have well, the Sabbath as a peace agreement, right? So there's yeah, well, I'm not gonna argue it. I just want to point out the frames, right? So he's talking about land and sea, and then civilization and wilderness. Yeah, you can use nature and cultivation there, right? Like that's just like a bunch of these things where you basically have an inside and an outside, right? And now we get to the membrane, right? Because like there's a mediation that happens between the inside and the outside, and it's important to realize that, because I was talking on Twitter, and I was talking like, what do you do with the pearls when you don't throw them in front of the swine? And someone said, well, you bury them. I was like, well, no, you don't. Like like you put them in the city, right? Like on the throne, for example, right? You decorate the throne with the pearls. You put them on display, and you let them participate in the glory, because you can't hide them. But also, like, the throne is in the castle, which is in the city, which is beyond in the city walls, right? And then he's like, well, that's the same as burying it. It's like, no, it's not. Like, the city walls are permeable, and they are open. like this, the gates of the city are open by default, unless there's a
They're
reason
on
not to.
display within the city, and if you bury them, no one can see them.
Right.
That's the more important difference.
And that means that you have to protect them, right? Because if you bury them, you don't have to protect them, and you don't have responsibility over it. So that's the distinction, right? And then, like this, the Republic goes into this, right? Like, ooh, when you have luxury, people will attack you. It's like, yes. and so if you hold glory, now there's this whole erection of problems that you have to deal with in order to maintain the glory, right? That's why you have the city walls. That's why you have the gates, like that. That's why you have vigilance. All of these things. They're there for maintenance, right? And so like you get the nature or the wild, right? And the civilization or the cultivation, right? There's several levels, right? Of this distinction of inside and outside, right? And like there's different rules, right? And like at some level, the outside is also the inside of something bigger, right? But like the bigger thing is less you, right? Like it's further removed, right? So you could say a city state and a kingdom or something, right? Like the bigger is there, but like the city is more direct in dictating your life than the kingdom is, and is always going to be. Um, and oh yeah, so the covering of the vines on the outside, right? Like we also have the idea of the dog-headed, right? Like so those who are in alignment in some sense, but are on the outside, right? So John the Baptist is one that springs forth. That's also again associated with the morning star, right? So like if you have people who live on the edge of civilization, right? Those are the first ones that you encounter, right? But the first ones you encounter on the edge of civilization are the least civilized, right? That's why they're on the edge, right? So they're not full representatives of the inside.
They're like the membrane of the inside.
Yeah, and in some sense, right, like it's also a journey, right? So like in order to attune properly, like you could see it. Like I don't know if it's literally happening in the Bible because I don't know this story well, right? But Paul going to Rome, right? Like the closer you come to Rome, like the the more Roman it gets, right? And um and yeah, like so you have to slowly be initiated to be in Rome, right? And to do as Romans do.
And I think there's also this kind of necessity of, last week we were talking about that thing of the breaking down walls for the sake of integration, like, an empire kind of expanding out and everything. That also, if you have these sort of things, there is that necessity of attending to the center as well, that kind of winds up, raising the centers, and then it's kind of like that rising tide raises all vessels type of thing, where it's like with that support, then even the stuff that's on the outside actually becomes maybe like one of the middle rungs or something like that, and then you can kind of expand out further.
Yeah, and you also get invested interest, right? You saw that with Spain, for example, right? Like they started as identifying with Rome over whatever they had, and also the bottom of France. So I don't have much on this page apart from the mentioning of style in the first footnote, because there's something there, right, with ornamentation that can be misapplied, right, or it can point down at the temporal. So one way, which is not necessarily ornamentation, right, but you could imagine, right, like you'd make really heavy arrows if you have to hunt bisons instead of birds or whatever, right? So like there's a making things proper for the moment, but it's not proper for the function of the bow, right? Or you could say, well, like in order to have bows that can do medieval warfare, right? We need longbows because people wear armor, and else like will just bounce off, and so you get these really useless bows like you can't use for hunt because like they're bigger than you. But they're still useful for the functionality. So there's something with style that's beyond, right? If it's focusing on the ornamentation, and then there's a part of the style that relates to functionality.
It's kind of like a specialization thing. So
Right.
I was thinking with that thing of like hunting larger animals rather than smaller ones, that thing of like back, especially in like the Middle Ages, like they would actually hunt boars with swords. Like they had swords that were specifically made for like hunting, and they would just go out and then just fight the boar, instead of, because the arrows just didn't make sense because it has thick hide and everything. So it just makes more sense. And it reminded me of this thing. So there's this aspect of like the ornamentation itself is actually the thing that winds up increasing functionality in some sort of area. And it's one of the things. So I have a single action revolver that I refuse to use until I have it modified. And because I want to change a few of the pieces out and have it refinished in certain ways. And one of those is for single-handed use. So it's actually going to become less effective in a particular context. And I'm going to have to change the ammunition that's used with it and that type of thing. But it is actually going to wind up requiring an entire changing out of the frame to accommodate a different shaped grip that specifically allows for this. So it's something that it's incomplete. So I need that kind of touch of cosmetic vanity that actually has like a practical application for the specific reason why I bought it in the first place like 2 years ago, but I've been doing other stuff, so I haven't bothered to pay for it.
Yeah, I like that. Like now we get into this idea of exaptation, right? So we create things for one purpose and then they end up serving another purpose, right? Because we have to remember that happens often. It's like, oh, I can use this for this. Yeah.
Does anybody
So
have any thoughts, just real quick, about? I mean, so if ornamentation is bound to time and it raises things up, does anybody have? I've just been wondering about the idea of modesty. So you might be modest with like clothing, or maybe monks, for example, they want to remove anything that would distinguish them and shave their hair. What is that idea, or I don't know. I guess what's going on there? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I do. So modesty can also be affected by your status. So it would actually be immodest for like the king of or an emperor or something like that to be wearing a monk's habit publicly. Like it's actually, and this is something that's kind of touched on a bit, I think, in the book of Esther, where she has all of this ornamentation, and she's an extremely humble woman. She actually says, that she doesn't feel like it's appropriate for her to be wearing it, but she is doing it without any sort of issue because it's her office, and that like she has to maintain the hierarchy in that way. So there is this aspect of kind of, if you're going to like a wedding or something like that, then you should also show up in like a hooded habit or something like that, unless you're, the couple that invited you to the wedding specifically invited all the monks at a monastery and knows that they're going to look like that. Otherwise, it would be odd. So modesty would be something more like appropriate measure, or maybe in this aspect of specifically ornamentation and clothing, it would be like decorum. So you could have that with like the type of speech that you have with a certain group. The way you talk with your closest friends is not appropriate in a job interview usually. But yeah, lesson learned. But yeah, I've done that before. But yeah, and then also this thing of knowing, okay, how should I dress? Because maybe you are overdressed or underdressed or something like that. And maybe it's necessary to have different types of dress in the same place, depending on, if you're in a choir or something like that, or something, you should be dressed in accordance with like a uniform with the other people for identification, or if you're a dog, like maybe modesty, you should have a collar.
But modesty is specifically related to your station, right? And so what is modest for one person is not modest for another, because they're at different places in the hierarchy. And this is contrast against exemplification, right? So exemplification, when you're looking up, say at the king, just quick example, is important, right? The king's not being immodest, but if you were to wear the king's stuff, you would be immodest, right? Because that's not your station. It's not because there's some quality of the jewelry or the crown or the ornamentation that makes it immodest. The immodesty is a statement of how you're signaling, right? What your garments of skin are in relation to your proper identity within a hierarchy. That's what determines modesty. It's not, we flatten the world, right? So like, oh, modesty means, you don't have any ornamentation, but it never meant anything like that, and still doesn't. Ornamentation is important because it's an exemplification. I mean, you want to look higher. If everybody dresses like a monk, then everybody's equal, and then you can't discern you from everybody else, and that's not better. That's far worse, right? That's the flood, like as referenced earlier. That's the flood. Don't do that, right? And so being within your station, having your place and signaling the appropriate place is super important. It's just you can't determine that from how someone's dressed. What you do is you infer their proper place from how they're dressed. And maybe, maybe they're being immodest, but you don't know that up front, right? That takes some kind of determination. And, unless you know their station, right? Then you can infer it.
So a couple things, right? You can dress more beautiful than the queen, and that's not okay, because now you're insulting her, right? You're insulting her station. You're lifting yourself above the queen. Same goes for if you sit on the throne while you're not king. No, no, no. I think King Arthur's sword, right? Like only if you're worthy you can draw the sword. Goes with that too. The other thing about monks is okay, like if monks dress all fancy pantsy, how can you look at their wisdom, right? Their like the things that they've cultivated. Like you have to attend and you have to show the things that are proper, right? Like so the queen is just there to show the glory of the kingdom, right? She's constellating the glory of the kingdom. So like that's the thing that she's supposed to embody. And a monk is supposed to embody the glory of God. So it's like you don't want to attend to the person because the person is distracting from God. And yeah, so it's important to realize these functionalities, right, or the purpose that someone participates in, right? So it's also like, okay, are you standing on the left hand side or the right hand side, right? Well, like that tells your alignment, right? And again, like Mark says, right, like that's then people know how to treat you. It's like really important. And so like when Jordan Peterson says when you go into a classroom, you know what to do, is like yes but no, right? Only if the classroom is actually organized correctly. It's like,
Yeah, it's related to proper orientation, right? And knowing your proper place and being proper. Like modesty and being proper are closely related. Proper more deals with action, and modesty more deals with garments of skin, we'll say, or affectation or something. But that's what that's all about. And so that assumption that ornamentation is some universal thing that everybody should have, a diamond necklace is wrong. Like, no, you should have the ornamentation that's appropriate to your station. And
a wedding
yeah,
ring.
A wedding ring, whatever it is, right?
Like, don't wear a wedding ring if you're not married. Like, and you had the women wearing their head in certain ways to signal like whether they were available, like all of these things. And yeah, we lost them. So I had notes by the second footnote, right? Because like, what is this talking about? Well, it's talking about contextualization and embedding, right? So like why do you have a wall around your city? Why do you have a gate? Well, because that embeds you, right? That allows you to have a certain relationship to the outside. It allows you to know that there's an outside and an inside. That means that you can treat the outside and the inside differently. Because if you don't draw that boundary, which is kind of what we're having in society now, like why we have borders, or we should have open borders. It's like, okay, like so now there's no distinction between the inside and the outside, and we have to treat everybody the same, right? So like even illegal people, right, they should be allowed to vote because there's no distinction between the inside and the outside. It's like, yeah, that's correct.
And that's a flood.
Right, that is a flood, right? Like that's where you remove all distinction, right? And then you have to treat everything the same, and that's literally their stated purpose.
Well, and also the grotesques are designed to warn against crossing the boundary, right? Like there's a cost for crossing the wall, all right? And to channel away the badness, take the badness from the inside and send it outside. That's why they're pointed out. That's why the gargoyle is a grotesque that funnels water away from the walls, out of the city, right? It's all bound up with that. I mean, I have a number of grotesques, you know, little gargoyle things. They're not technically gargoyles. They don't channel water, but yeah, it does demarcate and denote the outside and signal, funnel badness out and signal to the things outside that this isn't, you're not just wandering in the desert, right? There's costs to crossing these boundaries, and it requires a sacrifice of some kind, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the ritual of transition, right? Because like going outside means something, and actually you should say a prayer or something when you go outside, because like now you're encountering this alien thing, right? Which is dangerous, and you should switch your mental relationship from being at rest at home, right? Or at least at some level of rest, right? Because like maybe that's a better way to think about it. Like these are levels of vigilance with certain categories of attention, and you need to switch between them, right? You need to assume a different identity. So maybe when you go in the city, you have to deal with the snakes in people. Like if you go outside the city, you have to deal with snakes. So um, having those categories defined and understandable, right? Intelligible, that's the word that I'm looking for, right? Having that intelligibility and respecting that intelligibility allows you to find right relationship, right? It allows you to place yourself, right? We were talking about, well, the speck of sand that you're standing upon, right? Like, what is a transition between spaces? Well, that's assuming new grounding. Like it's assuming a new stance, literally, right? Like you're changing stance. Yeah.
I really,
Another. Oh, go ahead.
please.
Well, I wanted to also invite, right? So there's a perspective from the city going out, right? So this is kind of like the personal perspective, right? Just at a larger scale, right? Like so that's the natural thing, right? Like we know who we are, and then we look at the outside at what's not, and then we give meaning to the outside in relation to us. But there's also the other perspective of the outside looking in, right? Like who are you as a city to the world? Like who are you as a person or as a church to the city or whatever, right? Um, and like that's also a valuable perspective, right? And like I don't know the right place to attune to that, but it's something we should remember, right? Like we have a way that we present ourselves, right? And you can say, well, like, oh, I'm in the office of Queen, and therefore, right? It's like, well, but you, in order to wear the clothes properly, like you still have to realize why you're wearing them, right? Like who's looking, what is the way that they're looking, right? Like they're looking to you to be a queen, like they're not looking to you to wear the queen's clothes. So, yeah.
I really like this thing of the kind of the channeling the waters outwards, because it just reminds me again of the sort of giving the candy out of getting it out of your house, you know, and giving it to the grotesques that come to the door, you know, these little foreign figures that are right on your doorstep, and also this aspect of, so in that sense they are, you know, they're helpful, and also this sort of thing of thinking of just imagining the chimera as just like a three-headed bouncer as well, is just absolutely ridiculous. But it is kind of like a filter or membrane for, it's like, okay, you can come in, you can't, you know, these are the things that are going to be heading out. You know, literally, if someone does get in, to say, some sort of establishment that has a security guard or bouncer or something like that, and they're no longer participating in the principles of that space, then they get flowed out by the bouncer. So those are all sort of things that are happening there. And I was thinking of also this aspect of having these sort of tail-like figures of that also have kind of the invitation or call, that they're right there on the edge, and they're not necessarily like taking their place within the normal structure. But I'm thinking of kind of like St. Paul's I've become all things to all people aspect. So there's the high contrast aspect, which is really necessary for seeing, but also it's sometimes necessary to become extremely low contrast in order to kind of blend in with a certain group. If you yourself are in proper relationship to the principle that needs to manifest, and then like most aren't, then you have to actually, there is a sort of assimilation aspect that's necessary there in order to have some sort of influence. And I think of like, you get like Saint Mother Teresa, how she had like no spiritual consolation for like 45 years or something like that, and just experienced essentially like despair for that entire time, because she was surrounded by people who, if they were infirm and just lied down on the ground because they weren't feeling well, they would start getting eaten by random creatures even while they were alive. So it's like that, those horrific conditions had to be met with a mediator who was actually at their level, in order to become relatable in some sort of way.
Yeah, that's the struggle I've been dealing with. Mediation at the right level. Like, what does that even mean? Like in the physicality, like that makes sense, right? Well, like for some people, it still doesn't even make sense. Like that's the horrifying part. But it makes more sense. But in the spirit, that's like, yeah, that's like a whole different kettle of fish.
It's been a weird thing I've been experiencing, especially in the last like 2 weeks or something, that I found myself just kind of being, in many ways, invited to be this like little kind of like connector piece for things that aren't working in various different groups. So there's, there was a thing where my church had a new deacon that didn't know how to do some stuff, and I had no idea how to do any of this stuff, but apparently there were some instructions, and I was kind of actually called out days before by text by the pastor, who said, "Hey, I'm not going to be there to show this guy the thing, and like, I know you don't know how to do it, but also if you two can figure it out." And I was like, "Oh, we'll actually work through this together, and I'll offer support as best as I can as this kind of figure that I don't fit. Like, I actually don't, but we got the job done, and that was the important thing, and everything worked out just fine." And there's also another like 2 communities that are kind of disintegrating in a sense, and I've been invited by people to, "Hey, can you go and like, be a body here and just kind of do it?" And it was an opportunity for me to actually do stuff that I have some experience in, and realizing like, oh, there's some stuff that's kind of falling apart, and I'm this person that I have actually no place or title or anything like that in any of these groups I've been invited to, but it's just like, okay, we'll put a little bit of like paprika on this, and maybe we'll get something out of it. And it's been an interesting sort of experience of that. I still, even after doing that, don't have a place in those, and yet I can kind of just be like an all-purpose solvent or something like that in a weird sense, without actually having a proper place.
Well, the other thing that I've been realizing is that like just being there creates a place, right? As long as you act as a pillar.
Yeah.
So
I think we see that play out when we don't have like many people at all in like the book clubs or live streams or something, and then one more person shows up, and then we just start to see like, oh, now we have a whole bunch of other things to talk about just by having somebody there, even if they don't say much. I think is very, very helpful.
mm-hmm.
So I don't know if this is a really rough segue, but at the end of Daniel 2, it said that the stone that struck the feet of the statue became a mountain that filled the earth. So when you were just talking about how sometimes when you show up, if you behave like a pillar, it has an effect. Do Does anybody have any? I mean, again, that's kind of it's something that I was thinking about for what the meaning of that, as you know, what that means, what Daniel 2 and 3, and all just the story of Daniel because it was referenced here. Like in Daniel 3 is Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, right, where the statue's got the different composition, and then he built the statue out of gold in defiance to the dream. I had, I when I was reading, I realized like I'd never heard anybody preach that. It seems like that's an important part to the story, right? That okay, then Nebuchadnezzar is reacting to what was revealed to him through Daniel, right? But anyway, so I was just wondering about anyway, this part where the stone becomes a mountain that fills the earth. I've just been chewing on that, and I thought was
What?
triggered by what you were talking about, behaving like a pinnacle.
Like I think stoning, right, is also important there. Like, so what do you do with stoning? Well, like you throw stones at someone, right? So throwing a stone is symbolic of the taking down, right? Or like the literally, right? Like you're a stumbling stone, we're throwing you out. like it's the ritual of doing that, and then Jesus saying, he who is without sin cast the first stone. It's like, okay, like the person who is without sin that throws the stone will be the mountain. Like, yes, because they established the new order, right? Like they're like, okay, I can judge.
Well, and I think too, this is back to the stumbling stone and the pinnacle stone, because the pinnacle stone goes at the top of the mountain, right? Like that's what it is. So, in some sense, already covered. That's how I would resolve that. It really is that simple, right? That the stone has to have some ordained purpose, and even if that purpose is stumbling, that doesn't mean it's not the highest thing, in some sense, and that's really all that's meant to convey. It really isn't. It isn't a deep point in that way. It's a very wide and broad point, though, and I think that might be where you're getting confused, right? You have a bounded space. Like again, like with the bell, like you cast the bell, then you need a place to put the bell. Well, you got to build the place and put the bell on last, right? That's the pinnacle, right? Until the bell's up where it belongs, it's in the way. It's actually in the way, right? So it's the same thing, right? Everything has its place in time and space, but also in time. And that's what everybody skips to the end. Like, I want everything to be in its perfect place. That doesn't exist right now. You're going to have to get over it and instead put things where they belong and change their identity as the interaction changes, as the world changes.
So a perspective that kind of came up as you said that, Mark, it reminded me of, Manuel, your insistence on the word fulfill, which I think is exactly apt. So this aspect of filling the world or fulfilling the world, this kind of tying together or completing aspect of, okay, yeah, this is in the way, but also it's like, yeah, the thing that's in the way is going to smash all of the previous structure. And then it's going to be the thing that ties everything together, that you're going to kind of have that sort of thing emanate and then cap it all, or, kind of keep everything held together once it's in this proper place.
So
I think you can also look at that stone that topples the statue and it filling the world afterwards. I think you can also view it as, the statue gets toppled and then the world gets downscaled so that, the world is only as big as the rock, so that the rock fills it. Like there's nothing else in the world. Maybe.
No, like I'm not disagreeing. Like it's like I don't
It's
like
funny.
that perspective switching.
Well, there's this aspect of kind of like, if you have like a patriarch of a family or something like that, and then there's a big family that in many ways, like if they're all one body, like if they're all an extension of his body, then in many ways, like he did kind of, he got larger. So it's like, okay, well, if all of them are under his name as like the first point or rock of the family, then it's all kind of that rock in one perspective.
So I think that actually that's what you call downsizing. I think that imagery makes perfect sense. I mean, because it's it's not the same as raising as raising something up. It's striking down like a statue and disintegrating it. I mean, I think there is a directionality to it, but I mean, again, I don't want to get too much into details, but that does make sense. To me, it sounds as though like Nebuchadnezzar is being warned that, there's clearly a structure and something is wrong with it's been judged or something like that.
So,
That's what it feels more like, than as opposed to
but
something being lifted up.
so
But
so
I
you
don't
have
know.
to realize, right? What is a statue? Well, a statue is made in the image of man, right? Literally. And what is a mountain? And that's nature, right? Like that's the image of nature, right? So if something becomes a mountain, right, in the place of a statue, you could realize that there's a function, right, that you're reaching for with building the statue. And then a nature appears. The nature of the statue appears by you calling for it and calling it forth. And the adherence to the nature of the statue is the thing that allows you to topple the statue because you don't need the statue anymore because you know the true nature. And so now it's established. Right now you can make a covenant.
Mm. Yeah, that's very insightful.
You say it's something like the higher principle being like you're getting kind of the correct or like the genuine version of the thing, so there's no need for a copy or like a shadow or imitation.
Well, so I'll have to explain a bunch of things, right? So the realization I had on Genesis is it's working on 3 levels, right? So it's working on the level of being, right? So there's a condition for things to exist. Then it's working on the level of nature, right? So there's a nature to things, and then it's working on the level of human nature, right? So basically, man starts messing in the work of God, and then that's what the fall is, right? Like man starts messing at things that they shouldn't mess with, and then they fall down, and then they try to reestablish, right? So there's an integration of the human nature with the divine nature that is started. And what is a covenant? Well, the covenant is basically God saying, well, okay, if you have to be a fallen human being, then if you enact this pattern, then at least you have a safe place to stand, right? And so that's the promise that you wouldn't get flooded. He wouldn't flood the world anymore, right? Because like now you have a place to stand that has integrated part of human nature with divine nature, but it's not full, right? It's only a partial fulfillment, right? And then what happens later on in Genesis is they start like extrapolating to the group level, right? Because like you have human nature and then you have group nature as well, right? So that's like culture, right? That's why I pointed out at these levels where you have earth and sea, right? You have the inside and the outside. You have all of them at these different layers, right? And so like what are they doing, right? Like they're trying to establish a foundation that they can build upon that does not get flooded, right? And that's the pattern of the Sabbath. It's the continual return to that which has been proven true.
If the folks at home want extending reading on this, I found that I actually had a note that I made a couple of weeks ago for this that and I think this aligns in support of your point, but I'm not going to belabor it because I know we're running short on time and there's way too much extended reading for this. But St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews 8:5 is where it starts. I don't know actually where it stops, but it's probably for like a page and a half or something like that. But he says here he talks about serving a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain." So you have this whole kind of covenant mountain pattern copy thing going on all there. And he does go into good detail over the next chapter too.
Right. And going onto the mountain is basically standing on the pinnacle of that which is now established and having an overview over it. Right? and then you can say, okay, this is established. Now we're just gonna take this form and we're just gonna run with it.
And that's
and then he.
Well, the transfiguration with the previous thing, that it's like that's also happening there, where it's just like, oh, you're not getting the copy anymore. Like, here's just a manifestation of that's the pattern is happening there. It's not. This is not a
Right, and the first thing that happens is that he drops the crystallization in the tablets. Right, so this is like he's trying to implement it, and he doesn't even get to communicate. like it's because he's dealing with complete chaos as a consequence of him going up high. So and maybe that points at like well, the thing that Elena said, right? It's like okay, you have this new form that you got up at the top of the mountain, right? And like, how do you integrate that properly, right? Like, how do you conform to that properly, right? Like, so Moses has had this promise to the promised land, but like they still have to be worthy to enter the land, and that's the wandering in the desert, right? Like, that's the transformation that you have to go through before you can enter the promised land. Also, like, they kind of didn't enter, right? Like, that's the sad part. And the next generation, right? And so, oh yeah, that's also a pattern that I keep seeing now. It's like, okay, like the generation that's trying the thing does not get to do the thing. Like, and like I see it in people like Vervaeke as well, right? He's just like, he's the generation that's trying to resolve the problem, and like I don't see him resolving it, right? Like he has to hand it off, because like yeah, it's gonna kill him. Like, it's gonna be his death.
I'm thinking about the promised land thing, because there's only like two people from the original Exodus party that actually make it in, right? There's Joshua, and then there's the guy whose name I forgot, who in Jewish tradition, I think, when they were told to go into the Red Sea, before it was even parted, he was like waist deep or something like that. So there's this kind of like peripheral figure with kind of like with the waters kind of rushing around him like the gargoyle, that he was already like waist or chest deep before the waters started splitting. He was that like committed to the cause, and it's like, yeah, he got in, you know.
Well, so Pageau actually put out a video about Peter, right? And like he's also dealing with that pattern, right? Because it's like, if you are at the head, right, and not necessarily at the head as a king, but at the head of a movement, right? You're walking up front. So like, what is the guidance that you have, right? And like, more importantly, because this was what Pageau was talking about, is pride, right? Like how do you know that you're still in God's will and not in your own will? Because that's the sin of Peter, right? Like, not believing in God's will and thinking his own will is primary. So yeah, like, I think that all has to do with that, right? Like, if you go before things, if you lead, then there's a problem, because you're dealing with unknown unknowns, and like, how do you know that your attitude to those things is actually manifesting divine will instead of your own will? That's a huge question.
It's kind of like putting the cart before the horse type of thing. But also, if you are the horse that's supposed to be pulling the cart, and you've received that direction, then also you better be like chest deep in the water, you know.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or like John the Baptist, you end up having to be in the wild. It's like, yeah, well. Yeah. So yeah, so at the middle we say the strange saving the familiar, the impure saving the pure, the wild saving the tamed, the crooked saving the straight, the irrational saving the rational. So that's a lot of things, right? Like these are huge patterns. They're in storytelling a lot. And I think the issue that we see now is that we've turned these patterns, which are patterns of salvation, right? They save, but we started worshiping them, these patterns. So we're no longer seeing, we're no longer attending to that which is being saved, and we're just in a continual salvation, right? Which is fail forward in some sense.
Well, and also, I mean, just before that, right? In general, the covenant between space and time acts as a mediator or margin, right? And safeguards things. And so that's that third position, right? Which is super important. And that is the only place, we'll say, of judgment for certain things, right? So judgment for the mediation itself has to happen in that space. You can't judge the mediation from the extremes. That doesn't make any sense. And so, in a way, it separates this, idea that there are two poles and they're connected, right? But there's also a margin so that they don't, overwhelm one another, right? And so it's not a continuum, right? It's a cycle. And yeah, to your point, if you're not paying attention to the cycle, you'll miss the fact that you're not supposed to focus on, oh, we need things from outside to revivify our culture, right? Or you won't focus on, oh, we can't have anything from outside come in because we have to protect our culture. Like, what? Like, those are two extremes, right? And you don't want to focus on the extremes. But you need that mediator, that margin, right? In this case, through the covenant. But that's the bigger pattern that allows you to see this other pattern of, the symbol of saving. Or I might object to the word saving entirely and call it revivification. I think that's probably a better fit here in particular. Far be it from me to critique my my favorite author, Matthieu Pageau, but it might be more understandable as revivification.
Well, that's an attitude, right? Like that's.
But it's also the recognition that, like, you can't save anything. Like, that's not an option for humans. Like, that's not what we do. All right. But we can add what we have to the thing to make it better. That's revivification, right? So that's part of it. The other part of it, so that's more recognition of your proper role. Your proper role is not to save or redeem. That's not a thing you can do, right? Also, you don't have to, right? You can make it better with this lower thing. That's more important because it's lower. It's like the foundations matter. You can revivify it by adding what you have to it, and that, I think, is super important.
If I could save Matthieu's use of save, I just want to mention that now, for about 1,000 years, the word save has meant like to deliver from danger or rescue from peril or something like that. But the word soul, which is also where like the sola comes from and everything, means whole or to have well kept. So it is this kind of like keeping or observing or like maintaining wholeness. So like if you reject the last 1,000 years and then go back to the super old original one, then you can save.
Yeah, save is preserve. Sure.
Yeah.
Right. But in English, we've, again, we're living in this flat world. And so whenever anybody hears, we'll say Christianese type language or is in a religious context and they hear save, they're going off the rails and redefining the term entirely. And what they usually mean is redeem, not preserve or revivify. Right. And that's why that's where the pushback comes from.
Well, but like what is the distinction between saving and preserving? It's like, okay, you preserve something that's already established, you save something that's lost, right? So if you've lost, right, if you have domicide, like that's only saving. There's no preservation because there's nothing to preserve. So it's like, yeah, that's the only frame that's available. Like that's the only relation that's available.
Right. And I would say it's impossible for you to fix domicide for yourself or others. Right? Just not within your power. You can contribute to that process, which is a very different statement, right? But you can't do it. And that's what I mean. Even in that case, you actually can't do that. That's not a thing that you can ever do. And that's okay, right? You need to come to terms with that, but like that's the way it is.
So I want to point back to that these processes, right? So the strange saving the familiar have become worship, right? So like that's they see the means, they see the pattern that they need to partake in, right? But they don't have a grounding for the pattern. They don't have a way to contextualize it. They don't have a way to apply dressing to it, right? Like they can't dress it up. They can't beautify it. And in that disability they necessarily end up misapplying the pattern. And oh yeah, so then it will manifest through a perverted means, right? Which would be revolution, right? So it would be an imposition of the outside onto the inside, and thereby the outside is perverting the inside instead of saving it, because it's forcing a new identity on it instead of that it allows to integrate the external into it, right? So then that's where you get the power narrative as well, right? Because that's what the power narrative is, the imposition. Yeah, and then the last line, the invitation. It's like, oh, okay, that means that you can know that which is outside from the inside, like that there's a promise there, right? And Matthieu was talking about the lock, right? We need to know what the lock is, right? Like that's that promise. That's the pursuit of that promise is the lock.
So, how does the concept, just a quick question, how does the concept of victory surround the idea of salvation? How do those two relate?
Well, victory is the establishment of superiority, right? So like that doesn't mean, or that doesn't imply what comes after.
What do you mean comes after?
Well, like if I beat someone, like I can establish dominion, I can just walk away, I can subjugate them. Like there's many ways that I can exert that authority that I establish.
So, is it proper to view Christ's work of salvation as victory? It is.
Yeah, victory just means that you're above.
Okay.
Yeah, all victories are not salvation.
But salvation precedes victory.
No.
I think Christ's victory offers us salvation, so the victory comes first.
Yeah, there's this aspect of kind of all things being put into subjection. So there is this kind of thing of, okay, everything is subject to. So there is kind of this raising up.
Like and there's a nature to Christ, right? And the nature of Christ is a means of ruling, right? Like there's an extension from there, right? So if you partake in the name of Christ, right? In other words, you partake in that which has victory, right? Because you're following in the victory, the victorious, then you rule with his name, right? So you rule in his nature.
And so, like, if you were in service of, a worldly kingdom, or even like a high status company or something like that, you show up to a place kind of representing that name or kingdom or establishment or something like that, to a place that it carries weight, even if you yourself are not the person. Like, say if there's, there's like a high profile security organization or something like that that is actually named after the guy who founded it, that if you had something like that, that you show up and you're a representative of it, even if that's not literally your name, you are in that guy's name. And then, as an extension of himself, then you are kind of like an agent that is able to kind of extend that influence like a hand.
And it's inappropriate to use your own name, like
Yeah.
even, like
Yeah, that's it. It's funny. I saw a thing recently this week of there was somebody talking about like people going and wanting to like ask what their guardian angel's name is or something like that. And it's like, don't try to like ask for names or try to name, even worse, name up or anything like that. Just like, there's an issue with that. And this is something I encounter at work. I can't stand answering phones. And sometimes when I have to fill in for people, it's like, even now that I'm in a management position, I can't seem to escape it. And there are always those people that go and they don't want to give their name, even though they're asking for help. But then they want your name. And it's like, no, I answer the phone as the company. I say the company's name and greet you, and I don't give my name. If someone asks, I'm not going to make a whole thing out of it. But the problem is they're going to think that my name is Casey or Kevin or something like that. It turns into a whole song and dance. So I actually tell them, look, I'm trying to save you time, but there's these things that happen where people are like, oh, I want your name. It's like, no, like that's not how this works. You call the company, you're speaking to the company. That's what is happening. And when I worked at that college I worked at, I actually answered to the name of the founder of the college after which it was named. So like that was like people referred to me as that for as long as I was on my shift. And it wasn't like, not when they walked in person and spoke to me as a human being, but if it was over the phone or radio, like that's what it was. Like, you're speaking to the person who is participating in the college. You're speaking to the college, and then you're also speaking to, the representative of the guy that founded it 300 years ago. Yeah, that's essentially what's happening.
yeah, it's even worse, right? Because like one of my frustrations with the Paul Van der Klee crowd is that there's this assumption that I need to know who you are, so I need to know your name in order to understand you, right? So there's something like, okay, like you understand your relationship if you know what you're connecting to. As like, yeah, but like I'm not speaking in my name. Like I'm not representing myself when I speak, unless I give my opinion. Like I never represent myself. Like I only represent myself if I give my opinion. And like I just don't do that unless called for. So like I find it inappropriate that people want to know me in order to understand what I say, because like there's no me in what I say, because like the things that I say should stand on their own. And like if they don't stand on their own, I have failed. Like I have not properly represented that which I want to communicate. So I think, right, like that's it's one of the curses of our time that we try to find grounding in the person instead of grounding in the truth that they speak.
I think that's one of the things that was one of the major intentions behind the writing of this book as well. That Matthieu specifically said that he wasn't going to assert any sort of credentials or experience or even make references outside of the specific Bible things, unless it's like some sort of historical vague thing that he can make a generality on. That it is it's specifically there for us to be able to test, and if it's wrong, then it'll fail. And like that's just it has to be able to stand on its own merit, otherwise it's no good.
Like I want to point at the dogs being manageable versions of wolves. Like I think that's important to realize, right? So there's well, that's what sheep are, right? That's what cattle is. Like that's also in Genesis, right? Like there's the creepy crawly things, the wild animals, and then the cultivated animals, right? And the cultivated animals, they adopted human nature, right? They're participating in human will. That doesn't mean that they're human will, just like we're not God's will, but there's an extending quality that they're in our image, at least partially.
The office
And
of
if
I said the office of dog.
on the office of dog, yes, that's where you have dogmatism, the office of dog.
Yeah.
Let me see. Do we still have something else?
I think I have to run away a little bit early. I will be doing a reflection on my own, but I'm more or less out of time. But I really enjoyed, and I hope you'll have a great rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's see. So yeah, for chapter 51, like I had this idea of the external perspective, right? So like how are we seeing what's the functionality that we express? And I had two questions around this. What are the means by which it's okay to look at you from an external perspective, right? Because there's obviously means that are inappropriate. You shouldn't look at yourself in certain manners. And what is the manner that we're affected by the way that we have the outside world see us, right? Because there's a secondary effect, right? So if we, well, so for example, I know the office of Bookclub, right? Like I know the functionality, and so I know the ideal, I guess, at least hopefully. But I still have to manifest the book club in the here and now, right? So I need to realize that when I move, the book club moves, right? And so like in some sense I am seen or I'm received, and in that reception that tells me how to move, right? So that's kind of it's a way where you get drawn into who you're called to be if you see the requirements of your office, right? Of the place that you inhabit. So yeah, let's take that as a reflection and also try to make that into an intention for the week, because we want to integrate what we do here, and then we can discuss the things revealed to us. So I'd like to invite everybody back. Anybody want to share?
I had this thought about mirroring and self-examination. About how, well, the first thing that comes to mind is that I can physically see myself in the screen right now, and but it's a kind of materialistic image. It shows it doesn't show anything much more than the lowest level or the most surface level image of myself, and how maybe that isn't exactly what's necessary about um how I should be comparing myself against what is appropriate to my station, I guess, which is that's a spiritual thing. It's not a material thing. It can't be seen at the most um surface level of examination. So I think the mirrors that we have and the mirror technology that we have really distorts our expectations of what's appropriate.
Mm.
So yeah, when self-examining, a mirror isn't really good enough. That's my Well, and then the question
Yeah,
is like, what should you be using to mirror, right? And that is the question.
yeah,
Well,
that's
the
that's
mirror will show
interesting.
you what is, but not what ought to be
Mm.
when looking at yourself. So,
Mm. Yeah, so that's interesting because narcissist, right? Like he got caught up by the mirror, right? So there's something when the mirror is involved in cultivating our self-image, right? You can imagine that if you do your own makeup versus your mom does your makeup, and then your mom tells you you're pretty, versus like you have to look at your own imperfections and you try to get rid of them or whatever, right? Uh, like the way that it cultivates a sense of self. Uh, yeah, and to take that to the spiritual, right? So when we get feedback, right, from our environment, like what is it highlighting, right? Is it highlighting good job or is it highlighting I saw the effort that you put in and like I realized that you did these things and those allowed you to get where you are, right? So what's reflected to us in the people that we hang around with? Like is the reflection that we get a reflection of aspiration or a reflection of affirmation or a reflection of attainment? Uh, like what do we hold up high? Um, yeah. So I I took a little bit different angle in my reflection, which is I just said the word reflect, like we're actually doing it. Like I didn't even realize that until now. Um, so in my reflection, I realized that we have just different types of relationships, right? So first of all, we have relationships that are related to our office, but then there's also a temporal slash attunement side to a relationship, right? So in other words, there's things that a relation can hold. And in order for it to hold certain things, you have to cultivate that, right? And part of that is just commitment, like saying, okay, like I'm now establishing this relationship and I'm gonna devote myself to it so that I can make it manifest. And the other side is, yeah, you just have to work and attune, right? Because like if you're not attuning properly, like nothing can be held, even if you have devotion. Like then it becomes a weight, an unbearable weight. Um, so uh, to move that to my side of the equation is like, okay, uh, like I have to pay attention to what weight I put on the relationship, so I don't overload it. So that's not helpful, but still, it's a direction.
Isn't that something to do with relevance realization? Like that the weight that you put on it sort of happens in the moment.
Everything has to do with relevance realization, Gustav. It's like, yes, there is a way to attune to that quality of being, right? But it's just like 3 layers in or something, right? Like you have to establish multiple covenants, right? So you have to establish the covenant with like who am I, and you have to establish a covenant with where do I want to go, and then you have to establish the path. And then if you establish those things, then you can start attuning to the way that like you move. Like I need to write that down.
I mean, to me, the image of the Sabbath as having that devotional element makes it, in my mind, a more enchanted or a less mechanical way of thinking about relevance or reciprocal opening or reciprocal narrowing. So I was thinking about, the state of being addicted. The Sabbath is the thing that holds back the floodwaters. And so whether it's an act of grace that pulls you out of addiction, or it's, there's some will involved of getting serious about changing your life. If you think about, um, reciprocal, anyway, that language of reciprocal narrowing and opening, it sounds a little bit more mechanical. And so I don't know, but I could say that about almost many things. But during your reflection, I was thinking about like pride and vanity, of like why wearing a suit on Sunday isn't vanity because you're there for a specific purpose. Same thing at work, like it's to conform. And so it seems like the feeling of what a suit is, the signaling, it's like it signals maybe taking ownership of your life or various things. Um, um, what was I going to say? Oh, I guess. Oh man, lost my train of thought. I was leading
Signaling,
somewhere.
suit, place.
Man, I lost my train of thought. Well, so the element, I think that so the seeing things as pride or vain, I guess for some it may feel tangible, and so I think the recognizing that when you sense this is pride, vain, um, the quality of bringing first your first fruits forward in order to constitute something like a Sabbath, being aware of what is the most important thing or what's the most high thing about this impulse that I'm having. um, I guess it's just an observation that I'm having about the discernment process of when you have formed judgments about what things represent, being able to see kind of the connection of why. And so I suppose I'm just making an observation, but um, yeah, I guess that didn't go anywhere. So maybe I was just rambling about things I was thinking about. My bad. But forgive
When
me.
Well,
I have a question on that. When vanity submits itself to something higher, does that make it not vanity anymore? Or is it not vanity from the start if that's what happens?
why do you think vanity is a thing?
Because it's a word we use.
Yeah, but it's not a thing.
So I would say looking into a mirror is vain because it's a dissipation of your power and your energy. And that's because I've decided that allocating my power that way, I've decided that that's vain. Like I make a judgment that spending my time admiring my own beauty is the snake eating its own tail. I'm going to degenerate if I do this. It's not a high. There's something about there's an agency in me that I've,
Well, I would argue a little bit different, right? We have a purpose, right? And so in order for things not to be vain, they have to partake in that purpose. And everything else is in vain.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Right? Because you can't build vanity from the ground up. Like there's no vanity in things. There's vanity because it's not in something else. That's what vanity is. It's the lack of bringing together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also not a thing, right? It's not tangible. You can't hold it. It's like darkness. It's like darkness is not a thing. It's just the absence of light. Anyway, we'll end the recording here. Thanks for watching, everybody. Leave your comments, please. Feedback is important, especially if we not we're doing a Christian thing, Gustav. What are you doing? Why are you mirroring me? So we ended into with a Hinduist send up. Goodbye, people. Namaste.